Good evening. My name is Deirdre Cross, and I'm the Assistant Director of the National Museum's Assistant Director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture's Office of Public Programs. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program entitled Historically Speaking, Our Hidden Conversations, featuring a talk between Michele Norris and Dr. Carla Hayden, librarian, Library of Congress. Our Hidden Conversations is a unique assortment of stories, richly reported essays, and photographs providing a rare view into a remarkable period in our nation's history during which questions about race, identity, and social justice loomed large. Joining us to talk about the range of stories presented in the text is its renowned author, Michele Norris, the Peabody, Emmy, and DuPont Columbia Award-winning journalist, is also the founding director of the Race Card and in partnership with National Public Radio. And some of you on the way in this evening maybe picked up a copy of this card. And Michele would love to have your responses. So please put your 6-word essay on this card, and it'll be collected and turned in, and who knows what will happen. Maybe a second volume of our conversations will have your comments. Moderating the discussion this evening is Dr. Carla Hayden, the 14th Librarian of Congress, the first woman and the first African American to lead the National Library. Dr. Hayden has redefined and modernized the library's mission to engage, inspire, and inform Congress and the American people with a universal and enduring source of knowledge and creativity, which also reveals Dr. Hayden as a wonderful collaborator. I'm saying this because several years ago, the National Museum of African American History and Culture and the Library of Congress jointly acquired the Emily Howland photo album, where we discovered an unknown photograph of a very young Harriet Tubman, and we displayed that photograph in the museum's exhibition dealing with Reconstruction. The Howland album belonged to a Quaker school teacher, Emily Howland, who taught at Camp Todd, the Freedmen's School in Arlington, Virginia, at the end of the Civil War. We are fortunate indeed to have such enduring and enriching relationships with both women. So without further ado, please join me in a warm welcome for Michele Norris and Carla Hayden.
Hello, hello.
Good evening.
Hello, hello.
Good evening.
What a thrill to be here with Dr. Hayden.
Well, it's a thrill for me as a librarian, as you can imagine, and you can see that already. This was an advanced copy. And so it's wonderful to see in living color the book and to see how it is just, well, we'll get into that.
As a library kid, can I just say thank you all for coming out on a rainy evening. But as a library kid, it's just, when I met Dr. Hayden and gave her the copy of The Galley, we were in Middleburg for a film festival that you all should actually think about, the Middleburg Film Festival. And I was I think I slightly embarrassed myself. I was squealing.
And then I just was shameless and said, oh, can I have this? Because this was her reading copy and she was there and everything. She gave it to me and everything. So you can tell it's something, because this book, I think, should be required reading. Okay. Almost a textbook.
That works for me.
And because, well, how did it start? Postcards?
It started with postcards. it started out of a bit of desperation, may be too strong a word, but I had written a book about my family's very complex racial legacy, and it was called The Grace of Silence. And it was about family secrets and about all the things that many of us experience when the elders start telling stories, you know, when they get older, and if they're thinking it, they're saying it, and the filters don't engage in the same way. And I discovered that my father had been shot in the leg as a young man when he returned from his military service, when he was entering a building, trying to learn about the Constitution so he could pass poll tests in Alabama. And he stood up for himself when policemen tried to stop him, and he had a wound in his leg, and he never talked about it, never told my mom even. And my mom had a secret in that her mother was an itinerant Aunt Jemima, and she would
On the
travel-
pancake box?
On the pancake box. No, wait, let's be clear.
Okay, let's go.
Not the Aunt Jemima that they just removed from the pancake box, you know, the one that was recently removed, because she looked like she shopped at Macy's and got a wet set every Tuesday and had pearls and everything. The original Aunt Jemima looked like a slave woman. And Quaker Oats hired a group of women to travel the country and do pancake demonstrations to sell something that was new at the time, which was convenience cooking, which was cooking out of a box. You know, they moved from like 6 ingredients to convenience cooking, and they hired an army of women who went around the country and modeled convenience cooking at Rotarian breakfasts and Knights of Columbus meetings and country fairs. And my grandmother, I'm raised in Minnesota, and multi-generation black family in Minnesota, which is unusual. But my grandmother had Minnesota, the Dakotas, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Michigan. And she would travel around the country doing this. And you know, when Aunt Jemima is a member of your family, that's kind of a complicated story, so they just didn't talk about it. And in both cases, my father's shooting and my mother's work, it turns out she made good money doing this. I learned about it from an aging uncle, you know, who just started, we'd get together, pass the peas. Well, let me tell you about, you know, and then they just start talking, and you learn these stories. So I wrote a book about that, and when I went out in the world to talk about that book, I knew I would be talking about race, and at that point, which was 2010, I thought, Americans don't like talking about race. What can I do to make it easier? And so we created a version of this postcard, which you got tonight, and we asked people to share their 6-word stories on a postcard and mail it to us. And we printed 200 of them at the Kinko's on Wisconsin Avenue, next to what used to be the Red Door Salon, up by Bowie Mongers, and what used to be Mazza Gallery also. And of the 200 we printed, about 30% came back to us. So I started printing more postcards. I got my publisher to print postcards, and I was on a 35-city book tour. And I became the Pied Piper of postcards. Everywhere I went, I left postcards. I left them in restaurants. I left them in bookstores. If someone's book was on the bestseller list and you went to buy that book, out fell a postcard, because I'd put my postcard inside of it. I did so. I was really bad if I stayed at a hotel. I was leaving in the Bible. So if you picked up the Bible and you needed to read a psalm before you, what's this little postcard? So I just left them everywhere. But people found them, and they would write their 6-word stories, and they would send them to me. And in the book, you see, you know, on the pages, we have collages in between all the chapters, and you see the handwriting and how personal they are.
Now, why 6 words? I mean, how, because that's a tight.
Well, it had to fit on a postcard, because the idea is I wanted to do it on a postcard. My parents were postal workers. I just liked the idea of a postcard. I like the idea of 6 words because I thought people would understand it. There have been a lot of 6-word exercises. Minneapolis did 6 words, Minneapolis, 6 words, Sports Illustrated did, Wired, I think does, it's either Fast Company or Wired does one now. They're 6-word memoirs. I thought people would understand it. And Dr. Hayden, I thought if I asked people for a sentence, it would be like a run-on sentence that would go on forever. And if I asked people for a paragraph, it wouldn't fit on a postcard, And people would say, I can't do that, that's too much. But 6 words, you know, in the way that Wordle kind of gets you, it's kind of a challenge, and there's music to it. There's also a bit of poetry when you, there's a 2/3 rhythm to it. It just works. And it forces you to think about what is most important about my story. What is the thing that I can distill down to the thing that is the most important thing? And that was really useful. So you don't ramble, you get to the essence of it.
So it just says, what's your story? Identify your thoughts, 6 words.
Yeah.
Think about the word race, cultural identity.
Yeah. And we asked people, you know, it wasn't 6 words on racism, it was 6 words on race. And the instructions on the back, it was really brief. You know, tell me your triumph, your lament, your memories, your questions, your perspective. And it wasn't really a leading question. It was really sort of open. And in the beginning, a lot of people were writing in kind of, remember this is 2010, we had just done a Black Man to the White House, and we were allegedly post-racial. So a lot of people were saying there's no such thing as race, or there's only one race, the human race. Can't we all just get along, you know, quoting Rodney King. But then it started to get, you know, really deep. I mean, can I read a section of them?
Yeah.
Because you may be wondering, what can you say in 6 words? So I'm just going to, you know, why don't we read them together? If you go to the end where I have sort
I've
of
got one right here.
Okay.
Studying slavery made me feel ashamed.
Okay, we'll see. Yeah,
Just-
that's taken from the headlines right now, right?
I tend to scare white people.
Repeating proper pronunciation hurts my feelings.
My granny said, no white girls. So it started getting real.
Yeah, it started to get really deep. I'm light-skinned, my black is harder. I'm glad my son is white.
Okay. I can't trust white people fully. And you can just go and go.
Yeah. I will burn the house down.
This one, I'm white, my daughter is black. And then this one, he's not really yours, is he? Huh?
Or this one. So who is your daughter's father?
And then this chapter, you're pretty for a fill in the blank.
That's a whole chapter.
That's a chapter.
Because we have hundreds of cards from people who write in some version of that. What page is that?
Oh, this is 336. I had to tab this one. Because you're cute for a black girl. You're too pretty to be black. And then it just
said
goes on.
brown girls are ugly.
Darker skin can be pretty too.
But you do not look black. Child, she black, but she pretty.
Yep.
We decided to do a whole chapter on this because we had so many of these stories. And every time they land in the inbox, which is every week, my heart breaks. My heart breaks because the individual that's hearing this, but also because the volume of these stories, which means hundreds of women are hearing this and hundreds of people are saying it, and usually saying it as a compliment. Usually saying, you're different, or you know, you'd be a little bit better if you were a little less of this or a little bit more of that. And I just wanted to put that out there, you know, because what we try to do with this book is we want it to be a mirror. Like we're holding a mirror up to society and saying, see yourselves. And in that chapter, I wanted women to see themselves and say, you are beautiful just as you are. Any challenge to that is a lie, but also to hold a mirror up and remind us of something that we were talking about this in the back, that we usually think of the uglier aspects of race being the tornado that comes in from the outside. like this force that comes in from someplace else. But what this chapter reveals is that, as they say in horror films, the call is coming from inside the house. And almost every one of these cases, the person hearing this is hearing it from someone they love. They're hearing it from their love circle. They're hearing it from their grandmama, somebody at school that they respected, their auntie, somebody that sits at that table that is supposed to be that safe and sacred space. And so while yes, we have a lot of stuff that we have to work out outside of our homes, a lot of the stuff is also roiling inside our families. And there are, most of the women that are in this chapter are Black women, but there are Asian women, there is a Native American woman, I think hers was, I just saw it in here, enough to make you look pretty. You know, the idea that she has just enough white in her to make her look pretty, which is something that her mother told her. And, to make her feel good about herself, and it doesn't make her feel good. Those were the 6 words that she chose to share.
And you also give an explanation, or you describe what pretty is, the adjective, pleasant to look at. If you describe someone as pretty, you mean that they are attractive. So you really give the definition and put it there.
I leaned into this was a personal chapter, and I wanted people to understand that beauty is not the same as beauty standards. Beauty is given upon birth to all who walk this earth, like a gift that can be nurtured, embraced, or cherished just as easily as it can be twisted, extinguished, or denied by forces that believe they wield the power to police someone's worth. Beauty standards are something altogether different. They're product of a capitalist colonialist system that through laws, customs, messaging, and media portrayals create a metric meant to elevate some by ensuring a large group of outsiders were held at a lower rung. Beauty is only partly about appearance. Too often, it is an expression of power, a tool for enforcing an exclusionary social order.
We've shared some personal things backstage, and I'll save that for later, but I did share with you that I never forget a young man telling me, and when you're thinking about dating or something, you're thinking, he said, if you had better hair, you'd really be pretty. So, well, there we go. That's not a prom
I
date.
assume that, that he didn't get a dance.
No, he didn't. He didn't. But the cover of the book, though, is by a wonderful illustrator, Candor Nelson, who encapsulates all of the variety that's in this book. You mentioned you have people who are disabled who wrote in. A couple of people said, I'm white trash.
Yeah.
Just everybody, and that's what that cover really symbolizes.
Candor painted, this is one of his paintings that he did for the cover. You're familiar with Candor Nelson's work. He's our Norman Rockwell, I think, in our generation. We see his New Yorker covers, his fabulous, he did the Marvin Gaye stamp, actually several US postage stamps. And I got to know him years ago as a children's book writer. He wrote a book that my kids loved called Please Baby Please, that Spike and Tonya Lee wrote. My son is in the audience, and I read that book to you all until we practically wore out the binding. And we were struggling with the cover, trying to figure out how to capture a book about race, because most of our conversations about race are usually by, for, about Black people. The thing about this project is we put the basket on the table, and I thought, I'm a woman of color, I'm a Black woman, because most conversations about race are about Black people, I thought we put the basket on the table, I thought it would fill up mainly with Black people telling their stories. Much to my surprise, in the majority of the years that we've been doing this, the majority of the stories that have come to us, and we have archived, when the book was published, more than 500,000 stories. We've had tens of thousands of stories that have come in since the book was published, and we're probably going to hit 1 million by the end of the year, certainly into 2025. And in the majority of the 14 years that we've been doing this, the majority of the stories have come from people who are not black, and usually the majority is white people. And I didn't think it was possible to have a conversation that had that kind of buy-in from white America, because my experience as a journalist had been, if it was not February, and we were having a conversation about race, it was hard to get a lot of buy-in from white Americans, even in newsrooms. I'm just being honest. You know, if it was October, let's have a conversation. Oh, look at time. I got somewhere else I gotta be. You know, people would do almost anything other than have that conversation. So this was a surprise to me. And it made me realize that if you allow people to tell the story that they want to tell as opposed to react to the news, because if we're having a conversation about race and it's in the news, it's usually something that puts white America on the defensive, because it's usually something that's happened to a community of color. And white America is like, why would I participate in that conversation? Because there's not an easy place for me to do that unless I am an ally, or unless, you know, it's through a Black Lives Matter metric, or if you're on the other side, if it's Blue Lives, you know, whatever it is. But this was just, tell me your story. And a lot of people I didn't expect to show up, showed up, and white Americans of all kinds, including very conservative white Americans, who would send in their stories and say, like the story from the gentleman who said, white privilege, earned it, enjoy it. You know, and when he sent it in, he sent in a backstory, and it was an interesting backstory, basically saying that white men, anything good that had happened, not just in America, but in the world, had happened because of white men. And that white men were owed a debt of gratitude instead of scorn. And he said, I bet you won't print that. And because we're holding a mirror up to society, we said, yeah, we're going to print that, because that's what's out there. And so Candor, I wanted something that would capture all the stories that we got, because we also got a lot of stories from people who were Asian, South Asian, indigenous. It's not in the book necessarily, because this is a story of America, but we have stories that have come to us from more than 100 countries. And I don't even often know how they find the Race Card Project, but they send in their stories. And a lot of the people who are minorities who are not black are writing in saying, hey, what about us? Because in the conversation about race, which tends to be binary, black and white, a lot of people who are not black or white, but are part of a minority class, feel excluded or upstaged or overshadowed in some way, and not in this book. In this book, everyone is present.
Now, you mentioned that when the people first responded, they were doing it anonymously.
Yeah.
Hopefully the white privilege guy was anonymous.
No, he signed his name.
Okay. And then they started to identify themselves. So what did you make of that shift, going from like, I'm signing my name, I'm in it?
I think it was modeling. In the beginning, a lot of the cards came in signed anonymous. Some of them were signed anon. First, it started with postcards. We should say we created a website, because I thought what was coming in was so interesting that we wanted to share it. And we created a website, and then that allowed people to submit their stories digitally. And when people could submit digitally, then the inbox exploded. And while I love postcards and I love the handwriting, and I wanted to include a lot of postcards in the artwork in the book, the digital submissions allowed people to tell me what they meant by their 6 words. Because in the form we said anything else, and people would explain, well, this is including the dude who said white privilege, I earned it. He explained, you know, his backstory, and I could understand where he was coming from. So both the postcards and the digital submissions were coming in at first anonymous, and a lot of them were signed anon. I thought anon was a new name. I just thought it was like a Sophie or a Henry or a, you know, like one of the, like a new biblical name. And my kids had to tell me, Mom, it's anonymous. It's not.
Well, it's like LOL
Yeah,
or something.
yeah, like LOL or something like that. But I think it was modeling that once we created the website and we started to share stories, I think that that's why the cards got deeper because when people would see, they'd sign on and they'd see things like, I'm only Asian when it's convenient. Too black for black men's love. White, not allowed to be proud. And they'd think, ooh, people are really unburdening themselves. Okay, well, I'm going to unburden myself too. I think it was modeling. And then when they saw that people, oh, and they signed their name, oh, and they sent a picture, oh, and they sent, okay, all right.
Yeah, you became quite an archivist. You had all these different things. You had photos and all. And when people started really sharing about, and there's a major thread through it about being biracial or triracial, or this and that and everything. That was a major theme.
Because I think it's a major thread in American life, and we herald it as progress, and I think it is, in a country where that was illegal, where race mixing was illegal, but we also don't recognize that while it is progress, it is also opening up a new and complicated chapter on where people feel bifurcated identities, having to choose one or the other. People feel like, okay, I'm one thing, but sometimes your identity shifts over time. You go to college and you realize, okay, I get to express this side of myself. I never got to do that. I was a transracial adoptee, and I'm Chinese, and for the first time, I'm with other Chinese students. When you're on a dorm floor and you realize everybody else knows something I don't know. Like I never was exposed to dumpling culture. And that is a big thing in some communities, dumpling culture. And they come home and they say, Mom, why didn't you ever teach me about dumpling culture? And there, so there are small moments like that in the book, and aspects that are beautiful and some that are funny, and some, there's Mark Quarles, his 6 words are with kids, dad, alone, thug. Because he is a man who had dreadlocks, his wife is German and white, and when his kids are with him, they're caramel colored, and people can do the math and they can say, oh, wait a minute, okay, everybody, this matches. But when his wife is not with him and when the kids aren't with him, they go to Germany every summer and he walks around his very affluent neighborhood in Marin County. And people look at him and, do you belong here? So that's an example. There's the nanny stories.
Oh, and Eartha Kitt had that,
Yeah.
and Victoria Rall. And just to let you know, there are cards that you can submit some questions, because we're going to have question and answer. So there are cards that you could fill out the questions. You got them? Okay, we're going to.
If you want to share your 6 words or a story, but for the nanny, can I ask the audience something? Mm-hmm. Do you remember a news story that happened where a man was explaining something that was going on somewhere in the Korean Peninsula? He was a British professor, and he has got a tie on, and you remember, you're nodding your head, you remember this, and he is explaining all this, and all of a sudden, he's got a map up on the wall, and all of a sudden the door bursts open, and this little toddler comes barreling in the room. Like, she looks like the Lollipop Kids. She's just walking in there, and behind her, a woman comes in, trying to grab the child. The woman is Asian, and she grabs one child, and you think she's got one in her arm, and then suddenly an even younger child rolls in on one of those rolly things that children learn how to walk in. And the dad is trying to keep a straight face. He's totally lost control of the situation. She's flailing around trying to, and it was, I think they did a skit on Saturday Night Live. It was very funny, but everyone assumed.
She was the nanny.
Yes. Everyone assumed that the Asian woman was the nanny. Now, show of hands, when you first heard that story, how many people in this room assumed that the Asian woman was the nanny? Thank you for your honesty. A lot of people did. Why did we do that? It was his wife. And they later corrected the record, but that's an example of, there are, again, hundreds of stories that we've received from women who take their kids to the park, to the grocery store, show up at school, and they are presumed to be something other than the mother because they don't match the kids.
and one that breaks your heart too, page 239. When my spouse and I began the adoption process in 2011 with the National Agency, she was told black babies cost less to adopt.
Yeah. There's an entire chapter called Black Babies Cost Less to Adopt, and I did a lot of research on this, and it is a sad fact of American life and the beautiful system of adoption. It's not that babies cost, you don't buy babies, but there is a fee structure associated with adoption. And in all but the states that have actually taken this on to try to reverse this, the fee structure associated with adopting children of color is usually lower than the fee structure for adopting Caucasian children. And we have examples of it in the book where you can actually see the available adoptions, and for white children, for Asian children, for Latino children, for Native children, for black girls, for black boys. And part of that is explained in that black families don't participate in adoption as much, don't open their heart and their home to traditional adoption, because sometimes black families scoop people up in a different system that is not part of the adoption system. It's a more sort of elastic, less formal system. But in the formal adoption system, black families don't participate at the same rate. So some of this is explained as no one likes the word discount, but as an adjustment of the fees to encourage more people to participate. That's part of the explanation. In doing a lot of research on this over a lot of years, what we have discovered is that more than anything, it is a reflection of our values. And it was really hard to research that chapter. And I mentioned, I was in Portland recently, and it made me think of an encounter I had in Portland. I was speaking at Lewis and Clark College. And when I worked at National Public Radio, I had done a story about that 6-word story, Black Babies Cost Less to Adopt. And I didn't realize at the time that it had created an earthquake in the adoption industry. Like, I moved on and started doing other, but the adoption industry kept, at this and has been discussing this. And I discovered when I started doing research for the book that it really shocked that system. And also people within the system. There was a young woman who approached me in a book signing line after I wrote my first book. And she says, I know who you are, and I know what you did with that story about adoption, and I know how it made me feel. And that's one of the hard things about doing this story is, yes, I'm trying to hold a mirror up to society. So in some cases, we can confront these kinds of things, but at the same time, the woman who originally sent that in, she was worried about what her son would feel like when he discovered that the adoption fee was lower. And she's an adoptee, and she was basically saying, you did this, and this is how it made me feel. And every time I tell that story, I still feel just a chill up my back, because the pain that, and it's something to be read by a young person, and I was red that day. I mean, she gave me the kind of look that usually only an older woman can give, and I have never forgotten it. And at the same time, I'm glad that I've done the research, because otherwise it is something that festers below the surface. So we can only change what we confront. And if we can't confront these things, then they will continue to fester.
And they could be painful.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why you mentioned your grandmother with Aunt Jemima. You have a story about a young lady who plays, it says, why do you play a slave? And she's at one of the historic sites, and how she has to deal with that.
Nicole Moore. Is Nicole here? Because she has showed up at several of my book events, because she just happens, our schedules align. She does a lot of work here in Washington, D.C. She's a historian, and her 6 words are, why do you play a slave? She dresses up as a slave woman, and she basically, at Plantation culture is a thing. People go and sip mint juleps and look at what life used to be like on plantations. They hold weddings there and receptions. And she's, as a historian, she says, well, if you're going to do historical reenactments, well, here I am. And she wears authentic clothing, including Negro cloth, which is something I did not know about until I started, talking to her and researching her story. Negro cloth was a particular kind of muslin that slaves were asked to wear. It was itchy, it was scratchy, it weighed a lot. So if you were trying to leave, it was very difficult to do. When it got wet, it held weight. So she wears these, she dresses up and plays the role. And when people, all around us, we have Civil War reenactments in Manassas and places like this. And so she'll show up as the proverbial, skunk at the garden party. Well, you all are here in your Confederate costumes. Who do you think cooked for you? So she will set up and she will make authentic food. And she says, ask me questions. If you're going to do this, we're going to do this way. And so it was fascinating talking to her, about why she does this and how she does this and how people view her, because her friends think she's crazy. Other historians can't understand why she does it. But she's basically saying, if we are going to be obsessed with this history, then let's tell the history as it was. And one of the interesting things is when she cooks, she says that many of the people on some of the southern plantations where she works, when she starts cooking things like Hoppin' John and hoe cakes and things like this, they often say to her, that's what my grandma used to make. And she says that they realize that many of the people who are visiting these plantations have more in common with the people who worked the land than the landed gentry that lived and enjoyed life in the big house. And that totally blows their mind. And then she drives home at night and smiles.
Were there some other surprises that you got in working on the book? Because that sounds like that was something.
That was, I'm surprised every day. I'm surprised that people tell their stories. I'm surprised that people find me. I'm surprised at how they find me. Now that most of our cards come in, we still get postcards and I cherish them, and every so often they're beat up. It's like someone found a postcard in the bottom of their purse. Oh, I'm going to send this in. We still get postcards, but most of them come in digitally, and a lot of people find us. Because now we asked on the forum, how did you find us? We're used in hundreds of schools. That's a surprise. People often find us because they Google a question about race. Like, how do I do my daughter's hair? What do I say at the Tuesday diversity session? They don't turn to their friend or their spouse or their fellow congregant, or they go to Bing or Google and ask a really intimate question like that. And because we're so we're so, what's the word, SEO, site optimized or whatever the word is, we pop up because we're so data heavy, and people discover us, they lurk, they read other people's stories, and that's anthropological. Sometimes you have to tell a story to get a story. They read other people's stories, and then they are encouraged to share their own. I am also surprised at the level of engagement, because we are very divided as Americans. But one of the things that I've discovered on book tour, and it's been really interesting, this is the election year. I usually am out on the road as a political reporter. This year I'm out on the road I'm usually out as a political reporter trying to get to kitchen table issues. As an author now, I'm actually, between this and the work I do on my podcast called Your Mama's Kitchen, I'm actually talking to people about kitchen table issues. And as divided as we are, people are actually looking to try to understand the other side, trying to understand another life. People are actually curious about what's going on in someone else's life. And that is very encouraging to me, because I don't necessarily see that reflected in the work I do as a journalist, frankly. I think we focus on the divisions, and we don't focus as much on the innate curiosity that people have about each other.
So this is, we have a virtual audience, speaking of reaching out and everything. And as a children's librarian starting out, this is one I would ask. Can this book be adjusted for children? And what do little children write on their cards?
We've discovered something interesting. We're used in hundreds of schools. So we're used in junior highs, high schools, and then the majority is in college campuses. It's interesting that there's this period of, like around junior high, where the kids are totally unfiltered. Like they don't care as much. And then when they get to like junior high and high school,
They care.
they kind of button up. And then when they get to college, then it gets kind of deep again. We are doing a children's book. It's kind of around the concept of living in a box and how we're often defined by one thing, and we're not just one thing. Converting a book that has an entire chapter on lynching and an entire chapter on Germany decided to remember a difficult past is difficult to totally translate into a children's book. So the children's book will not be sort of an abridged version of this. It will be different, but aligned with this, and we'll have a lot of young people's 6-word stories. But the work that we do in schools is really interesting, because in some cases, people use it to stoke conversations. In some cases, they use it to look at history. After police shootings, it's been interesting because schools have used it to provide a way for students to talk. And they make discoveries themselves because they realize, kids feel this way if they're students of color and they relate to the person whose death we saw on a small screen. But this group of kids, their family works in law enforcement. And they're silent, but they're deeply confused about how they should feel about that moment. And this crazy little 6-word exercise provided a way that they could have a conversation in a classroom that might not have been possible otherwise.
This is from the audience here. Tell us about the Breadcrumbs chapter.
Ooh, girl. You must have read the book. The Breadcrumbs chapter could be an entire film, each of the stories in the Breadcrumbs chapter. It's 3 stories about 3 women who were all mothers, who all told lies to their daughters because of race. In one case, a woman who lives here in Washington, D.C., actually lived in D.C., now lives in eastern Maryland, eastern shore of Maryland, discovers that her mother, when she came to the United States, shaved some years off her age, changed her marital status, her parents' marital status, and erased the fact that her father was a black man in Peru. And so she discovers rather late in life that she's a person of color, and makes this discovery shortly after Barack Obama is elected, and then lives with this discovery as Donald Trump enters office. So she's kind of going through, becoming raced at an interesting moment. Second story is from a woman who gets a phone call from someone who is her brother, but she doesn't know it's her brother. And it turns out her mother, who is white, had a second family very early before she had this family. And you'll have to read the book to understand what happened, but he was not the only sibling. And so the contortions that she had to go through to basically give up kids of color because she couldn't find an apartment, couldn't find help. Her family said, don't you bring those babies back here. Mm-hmm. So you might want to judge her, but it was difficult. And a third story about someone who grew up only brown kid in a big family. Her mother had a relationship with a black man who she said she could not find. And later in life, Stephanie finds her dad, and it turns out that he would have wanted to have a relationship with her all along, and so she just had a few, basically almost 2 years with him, before he died. And they're beautiful stories. In all 3 of these stories, in the audiobook, you get to hear the voices of the women tell these stories, so it's not just me conveying it. I wanted the audiobook because I worked in audio for so long to be an experience. So the audiobook feels like a long podcast. But that Breadcrumbs chapter is sort of in conversation with my first book, because the secrets that families hold and the way that all three of those women realize that their mothers, who didn't tell them the truth, at the same time were leaving clues all along. That they were trying to say something that they couldn't bring themselves to say. And that is such a universal story in the stories that we encounter that involve secrets, and there are a lot of them, because we've placed so much weight on race, on skin color, on class. I mean, we're a country where everybody came from someplace else unless you are truly indigenous. And when people came here, they massaged the story, and they were able to, America is a land of reinvention. And in reinventing people, when people reinvented themselves, even through migration, you migrated from Mississippi to Chicago, new slate, new chance. I can be someplace else. I can be someone else. And a lot of those histories are lost, and that's why I called it Breadcrumbs.
From the virtual audience, what responses stunned you the most?
Well, stunned, the black babies cost less to adopt.
That was the one.
That was a gut punch. That was a gut punch. But there was someone who wrote me. He's not in the book, and I may be called to write another volume at some point, because we have 500,000 stories, and there are about 1,000 that are in the book along with my essays. I couldn't include everything. But he wrote in 1972, Mississippi drowning, not an accident. And that one hurts. And I interviewed several people involved, and I have a whole big fat chapter of research on it. But it was a case where a group of kids from Atlanta went to Louisiana, where the circuit court is based in Louisiana, and there was an integration case that would impact the school system in Atlanta, and so they went to visit Judge Tuttle in DC. Some of you may know Judge Tuttle, well-known judge who's heard a lot of the integration cases. They wanted to see justice in action and go see, actually what happened in a courtroom. And on the way back, they couldn't stay at hotels. Integration was kind of new, so it was still hard to find. People were still keeping green books in the car, and so they often stayed at revival halls along the way. And they were staying at a revival center in Gulfport, Mississippi, and there were 41 kids, and it was hot, 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 and they had a bus ride home, and they let the kids go into the water. Gulf Coast, Mississippi is, known for eddies and riptides, and a boat came and kicked up the water, and 41 kids went into the water, and only 38 came out. And the person who wrote me that story, he was one of the kids who worked for a volunteer group that was taking the kids on these tours out of Atlanta. And on election night, the night that Barack Obama was elected, he was on the phone with a nun who was part of that group also. And they were in tears on the phone because she said, did you do the math? And he said, yeah, I did the math. 2 of the kids were the same age as Barack Obama. And he couldn't help but think about, they didn't get to see this, that, they just were, and he was moved to share his story with me. And that's why this crazy project that I started in the 3rd floor of my house has become a weird obsession for me, because again, that's a breadcrumb, right? That these stories surface things that are not in our history books. And those 3 children perished, and there's one little teeny newspaper article about them. They couldn't find a funeral director to take their bodies. They had to get Andrew Young involved. Andrew Young got involved, and still there's no record of this. So it's a weird thing, and you understand this as a librarian, when you become an accidental conservator of history, and that's why my family has put up with boxes and boxes of these cards, and me trying to do my day job and holding on to this over here because I can't let go of it, because this accidental archive is capturing a piece of American history that might otherwise be lost, because it's the one time that people choose to tell this story. Because I asked them to share 6 words. And so that's an example of the stories that stun me. And usually when I get that urge, then I start digging and I start looking, and so I have files of these stories that I start researching, and it's a constant education for me. I'm constantly learning about America, and America that as someone who considered all things for 10 years, I realized that there's a lot of things that I just couldn't get to, because when it comes to race, we have a surface conversation about the things that divide us, and we reach to the same voices over and over and over again, and we don't talk about race and identity through the prism of personal experience enough, and that's what this archive allows me to do.
Someone had asked me what are Dr. Hayden's 6 words. Thank you for this book. Thank you. And one from the audience. What has been, just give some of the reactions when you're presenting to a mixed group, like tonight. What are the reactions?
Sometimes I don't know, because there's a whole chapter in the book about an audience I spoke to in Morris, Minnesota. The University of Minnesota, Morris, is an outpost of the UM system. It is a former Indian school. It's on the site of a former school where they were basically acculturating students that were taken from their homes. And so it has a very large native population, because if you are a member of a tribe, you either get free or greatly reduced tuition. When you speak to an audience, sometimes it's an emotive audience, sometimes you're connecting with people. I thought I bombed that night. I just felt like, I don't know, it was cold. Minnesota can be cold like nowhere else can be cold. And I just didn't feel like I connected. And then the cards started to come in from the audience. And maybe people were just pensive, because I started to get, and there's a whole chapter in the book about 2 cards that came in from one man who is white, whose family worked the land. His 6 words were, "I flourish farming ancient tribal lands." And another woman who's native, whose family was part of the Lakota Dakota Sioux, who were forced marched off the land in Minnesota. And they're like in the same audience, and their histories are totally intertwined, from the War of 1863, which I learned nothing about, even though I went to school in Minnesota, and wound up again doing a bunch of research and surfacing a story that should be in our history books, that we all should know. The largest mass hanging in America to this day, sanctioned by the US government, took place in Mankato, Minnesota. 38 Dakota Lakota Sioux were killed, and then forced marched off the land. And then the state of Minnesota takes its name from the Sioux Nation, but from the people who were, isn't that a trip? The state, my home state, I love my state, but the state takes its name from the people who were forced from the land. So that's, that happens. What I also love is that most of the times when people start to share 6-word stories, they start to have conversations in the room, and there are connections in the room. We haven't really done that here, but people sometimes stand and just like share their 6-word stories. And the most, I've been a journalist for more than 30 years. I'm up in age now, and I have spent most of my career asking people to listen to me on the radio, to listen to me when I worked as a television reporter, to read the columns that I write, to pay attention to the work that I do. This is the most important work I've done. It's to the extent that I leave any kind of mark on this earth, it's my legacy beyond my children, which they are my most important legacy. But in terms of my work output, this is most important because it is a vehicle for people to listen to each other. And we don't have a lot of that. We have devices that allow us to communicate more, but they seem to divide us more than connect us. And this book literally allows you to see through walls because people are so vulnerable. And I guess that's one of the biggest surprises for me, is just the deep vulnerability in these cards. And then people sign their name and send a picture. And if you want to get in touch with me, here are my digits. And I'm able to call people and do deeper oral histories with them.
I have a feeling that during the book signing that's going to start in a few minutes, you're going to hear some more stories. I just have a
Probably.
feeling. Well, my 6 words stand. Thank you for this book. I hope it becomes a textbook and that you have a follow-up.
Thank you.
And I want to thank all of you all for being here too.
Thank you, Dr. Hayden. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming out on a rainy evening.
Thank you
And
so
guess-
much for, oh, I'm sorry. Were you finished, Dr. Hayden?
Yes,
Oh,
but I'm
so
going to
sorry.
give her these cards.
Yes. Thanks again for a wonderful conversation, and please go upstairs if you haven't already and purchase a book and ask more questions, get your book signed, and have a wonderful trip home.
Thank you all.
Thank you.